At his lavish birthday party, millionaire Elliot Harrington proudly flaunted his stunning mistress, basking in the envy of his wealthy guests. But when his wife, Victoria, took the microphone, the entire room froze. With one shocking announcement, she stripped him of everything: his fortune, his power, and his pride. The room shimmered with the glow of golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off crystal glasses filled with aged whiskey and champagne. Waiters in crisp black and white uniforms weaved through the grand ballroom, their silver trays balancing delicate hors d'oeuvres that no one was eating, but everyone pretended to admire. Conversations buzzed in elegant circles, murmurs of deals, scandals, and wealth-laced gossip floating through the air like the sweet scent of imported cigars. At the center of it all, Elliot Harrington stood like a king surveying his court, his tailored navy tuxedo hugging his broad shoulders, his signature smirk fixed in place. A man who thrived on admiration, who bathed in the envy of his peers. Tonight was his night. After all, his birthday, another celebration of his continued success, another reason for the elite to raise their glasses to him. Victoria Harrington, his wife, moved with effortless grace through the party, her emerald green dress fitting her like a second skin, the diamonds at her ears catching the light in a way that made the whole room take notice. She had always been a vision of control, elegance, and quiet power, a perfect complement to Elliot's loud arrogance. Tonight, however, she wasn't his complement. She was something else entirely. Elliot noticed the shift in the air before he fully understood it. The usual whispers of admiration toward his wife had been replaced with something else: curiosity, suspicion, even amusement. It took him a moment to realize why. Victoria was smiling, but not at him. She was speaking, but not for his benefit. There was something unsettling about the way she moved, the way she looked at people, the way she stood with just a fraction more distance from his side than usual. Still, he dismissed the feeling. This was his night. He had nothing to worry about. A burst of laughter erupted from a group nearby, and Elliot, always drawn to the sound of admiration, turned toward it. His arm slid easily around the waist of a woman who had been clinging to his side all evening. Sienna Blake, younger, striking, the kind of woman who turned heads and invited stares. She was dressed in a sleek, crimson gown, her long, dark curls cascading over her bare shoulders, her smile full of mischief and whispered promises. Elliot didn't bother with discretion. He never had. He leaned in close to Sienna, his lips at her ear, whispering something that made her laugh, her hand playfully pressing against his chest. He didn't notice the way Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, or the way some of the guests had turned their attention toward her, waiting for a reaction. None came. Instead, Victoria calmly set her glass down on a tray as a waiter passed by. She excused herself from the conversation she'd been having with the mayor's wife and walked toward the center of the room. Elliot was too busy enjoying himself to notice her at first. He was lost in the rush of being adored, of being envied. But then, a single, deliberate clink echoed through the space as Victoria tapped a silver spoon against her champagne glass. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Elliot turned, still smirking, expecting some toast in his honor, another public display of how fortunate he was. Instead, he was met with Victoria's unreadable gaze. Her smile was there, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't affectionate. It was something else, something sharp. "Good evening, everyone," she said smoothly, her voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate my husband tonight." A murmur of polite acknowledgement rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke. There was something in her tone, something that made even the most self-absorbed guests pause. Elliot felt an odd shift in his stomach. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her eyes flickering toward Sienna for the briefest of moments before returning to him. "I believe birthdays should be about appreciation," she continued. "A time to reflect on what we have, what we've built, what truly matters." Elliot forced a chuckle, stepping forward slightly, attempting to take control of the moment. "Well, darling, I think we can all agree I've built quite a—" Victoria held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. He froze. She had never done that before. The room was still. A strange sensation crawled up the back of his neck. Victoria's eyes locked onto his, and she smiled wider. "Which is why I think tonight is the perfect moment for me to give you your birthday present," she said. "Something I've put a lot of thought into." Something truly fitting. Elliot's smirk faltered for the first time. The air in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. A current of anticipation. A slow, creeping realization that something wasn't right. Victoria reached into a sleek leather folder that she had been holding, one that no one had noticed until now. With deliberate ease, she pulled out a set of crisp, legal documents. She held them up, letting the light catch the embossed lettering at the top. Divorce papers. The crowd gasped. The smirk disappeared from Elliot's face entirely. "Happy birthday, darling," Victoria said, her voice silky smooth. "I'm giving you exactly what you wanted." The silence was deafening. Elliot stared at the papers, his brain struggling to catch up with what was happening. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. A low hum of murmurs spread through the guests, shock rippling like waves in a still pond. Victoria wasn't done. Her fingers brushed lightly over the next set of papers in her folder. "Oh," she added, almost as an afterthought. "I should also mention, I've gone ahead and finalized the transfer of all company shares." She turned slightly, looking at the stunned faces around her before her gaze returned to Elliot, and she tilted her head, as if feigning mild curiosity. "They're in my name now." The murmur turned into a buzz. Elliot's hands curled into fists at his sides. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "You didn't think I'd been standing by your side all these years without learning how to play the game, did you?" The weight of her words settled over him like ice water, cold and suffocating. The room swayed around him. His birthday party. His moment. And yet, all eyes were on her. He was no longer the center of attention. He was the spectacle. And she was just getting started. If you were in Victoria's place, would you have done the same? Or would you have walked away quietly? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The weight of Victoria's words settled over the room like a dense fog, thick with shock, disbelief, and barely restrained fascination. The guests, frozen in place with half-empty champagne flutes and suspended conversations, absorbed the spectacle unfolding before them. The whispers, once contained in discreet corners, now ran rampant. Had they heard correctly? Was she really divorcing him? Was this a joke? No, there was no jest in her voice, no hesitation in her delivery. This was real. Elliot Harrington, a man who had spent his entire life ensuring he was always 5 steps ahead of everyone else, had been blindsided in front of 100 of the city's most powerful and influential figures. His body, once relaxed in the comfort of his own arrogance, went rigid. His jaw clenched, his mind scrambling to regain control. This wasn't supposed to happen. Victoria, on the other hand, stood calmly, her presence an immovable force in the center of the chaos she had just ignited. She could feel the heat of Elliot's glare on her, the fury and confusion flickering in his eyes. He was unraveling. She had spent years watching him control the narrative of their marriage, their business, their public lives. And now, with a few calculated words, she had taken the power away. But to fully understand the depth of this moment, one would need to step back in time, to the beginning, when Victoria and Elliot had been something entirely different. Victoria Beaumont had never been a woman easily swayed by charm, though Elliot had been particularly persistent in his pursuit of her. She was sharp, ambitious, the daughter of a successful real estate mogul, raised with an understanding of power and leverage. When they met at a gala nearly 2 decades earlier, Elliot had been the young, daring businessman with a mind for deals and an ego to match. He was magnetic, insufferably confident, and he knew exactly how to manipulate people into giving him what he wanted. Victoria, however, had not been easily impressed. She had watched as Elliot worked the room that night, charming investors, smoothly slipping into conversations that weren't his to join, always leaving with some new advantage in his pocket. It was a skill she recognized, even admired in its own way. When he had finally turned his attention to her, it had been with the same smug certainty he had with everyone else, that she would fall in line, become another conquest, another extension of his empire. She had made him work for it. Elliot had been relentless in his pursuit, showering her with attention, proving that he wasn't just another smooth talker. And, to a degree, he had succeeded. They had built something together, not out of pure love, but out of mutual ambition, a marriage that was less about devotion and more about dominance. Victoria had played the part of the perfect wife, and in return, she had been granted access to a world where she could wield real power. For a while, it worked. They became a force, powerful, untouchable. Elliot made the deals. Victoria ensured they were bulletproof. He cultivated the image of the charismatic businessman, and she was the elegant wife who kept the world believing in the illusion of their perfect life. But perfection was fragile, and cracks had formed early on. Elliot had never been a man who settled for just one conquest. Power, after all, was a game, and he liked to win in every aspect of his life. The affairs had started small, quiet, nothing that could taint their image. Nothing Victoria couldn't control. But over time, Elliot had grown reckless. The mistresses became more public, the whispers harder to ignore. The balance shifted, and for the first time, Victoria had to decide whether she was willing to simply exist in the world Elliot had created, or if she was capable of creating something of her own. The choice had been clear, and now, as she stood before him, the divorce papers in her perfectly manicured hand, she had finally executed the endgame she had been preparing for years. Elliot's fingers twitched at his sides, his mind racing through every possible counterstrike, every way he could regain control of the situation. He had always believed Victoria would stay, out of loyalty, out of convenience, out of the simple fact that she needed him as much as he needed her. But he was realizing, far too late, that she had never needed him at all. "Victoria," he finally said, voice low and sharp, meant only for her ears. "You're making a mistake." She arched a brow, a small, knowing smile gracing her lips. "Am I? You don't want to do this here," he warned, trying to keep his voice steady. But he could feel the rage curling at the edges of his control. Not in front of them. His eyes flicked to the guests, who were pretending very poorly that they weren't watching with rapt attention. But Victoria tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Then, in a voice meant for everyone to hear, she responded, "Why not? You were happy to flaunt your infidelity in front of them. Why should I be any different?" The room exhaled collectively. A few guests had the decency to look scandalized, others merely intrigued. Some, like the ever-present Jack Aldrich, Elliot's closest business rival, were outright delighted. Jack lifted his champagne glass slightly, smirking at Elliot from across the room. Sienna, the mistress, stood frozen beside Elliot, the flush in her cheeks now a deep crimson. She looked at Elliot, then at Victoria, then back at Elliot, as if just now realizing she was caught in a storm she hadn't fully prepared for. For years, Sienna had watched men like Elliot operate, powerful, dominant, untouchable. She had bet on the wrong man. Elliot took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "You want to do this, Victoria? Fine. You want to play dirty? Let's see how well you do without me. That company, our company, doesn't run itself." Victoria exhaled, almost like she pitied him. "Oh, Elliot," she murmured, shaking her head as she placed the papers on a silver tray, the legal text glaring up at him like a death sentence. "It stopped being our company a long time ago." The words didn't hit him right away, but when they did, they hit hard. He reached for the documents, scanning the top page, eyes locking onto one detail, the ownership transfer. It wasn't just a divorce. Victoria had taken everything. The last shred of his smirk fell away. For the first time in years, Elliot Harrington knew what it was like to lose. And as Victoria turned on her heel, walking away with the poise of a woman who had just won a war, he knew something else, too. This was only the beginning. The night stretched long and slow, a heavy silence settling over the grand ballroom after Victoria's stunning revelation. Guests moved in careful clusters, their voices hushed, but their excitement barely contained. The whispers spread like wildfire. Had she really done it? Had she really taken everything? Reaching corners of the city that Elliot himself had once ruled without question. Elliot stood frozen in place, the divorce papers still in his grip, his mind working at a pace that couldn't keep up with the reality in front of him. The ink on the documents might as well have been a knife to his throat. How had he let this happen? How had Victoria, his wife, the woman who had spent years by his side, always composed, always predictable, managed to blindside him so completely? For the first time in his life, Elliot Harrington had no immediate countermove. Victoria, on the other hand, had already disappeared into the crowd, her presence lingering in the air like the final note of a symphony. A few guests tried to approach her, but she moved with purpose, slipping through the party with a quiet sort of finality. She wasn't lingering to bask in her victory. She had made her statement, delivered the killing blow, and now she was simply walking away. Jack Aldrich, ever the opportunist, took a slow sip from his champagne and smirked in Elliot's direction. Hell of a party, Harrington. Shame it wasn't actually yours. Elliot barely heard him. His pulse was hammering in his ears, drowning out the sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of guests who didn't even bother hiding their enjoyment of his downfall. He was losing control, and worse, he knew it. Sienna, who had been standing awkwardly beside him, shifted uneasily. Her once glowing confidence had been replaced by uncertainty. This wasn't the man she had attached herself to, not the powerful, untouchable Elliot she had bet on. This was someone else entirely, a man slipping through his own grasp. "Elliot," she murmured, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away. His expression darkened, his fingers curling around the papers as if they might somehow disappear if he gripped them tightly enough. The room was suffocating. He needed to get out, needed space to think, to plan, to breathe. Without another word, Elliot turned sharply and strode toward the exit. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect, but out of something colder, something closer to satisfaction. By the time he reached the grand double doors and stepped into the cool night air, he barely registered the sound of the party continuing behind him. Victoria hadn't just humiliated him, she had dethroned him. Inside the ballroom, the whispers only grew. "I can't believe she actually did it," someone murmured near the bar. "She must have been planning this for months." "No, years," another voice chimed in, full of intrigue. "A woman like Victoria doesn't move without a strategy." "And did you see Elliot's face?" "I've never seen him look lost." "He should have expected it," a woman scoffed, swirling the last of her wine. "You parade your mistress in front of your wife and expect her to just smile and nod? Please." Not far from them, Jack Aldridge leaned against a marble column, watching the scene unfold with pure amusement. He had never liked Elliot, not really. The two of them had been competing for power for years, exchanging victories in boardrooms and backroom deals. But now, Jack was watching his rival crumble from the inside out. It was beautiful. He took another sip of his drink, then turned to Victoria, who had just stepped onto the terrace, overlooking the city lights. "You really outdid yourself tonight," he said, his tone laced with admiration. Victoria didn't turn to look at him immediately. She simply took a slow breath, as if drinking in the taste of her long-awaited victory. Then, with a slight smirk, she finally spoke. "I told you I had a plan." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "That you did. Though, I have to admit, I never thought you'd go this far. Divorcing him publicly? Claiming his shares? Well, it's impressive." Victoria finally turned her gaze toward him, her expression calm but sharp. Elliot has spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. He thought power came from control, from money. But power doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room, Jack. It belongs to the smartest. Jack let out a low whistle, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Victoria's smirk deepened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she let her gaze drift back to the cityscape. The world below was hers now, in more ways than one. And Elliot? Elliot was no longer her problem. Across the city, Elliot wasn't thinking about his lost reputation or the whispers of the elite. He wasn't thinking about the party or even the public spectacle Victoria had just made of him. No, his mind was stuck on one single, haunting question. How the hell had he not seen this coming? He sat in the back of his car, the city lights flashing past the tinted windows, his fingers drumming against his knee in restless frustration. The divorce was shocking, yes, but the business? The company? That was impossible. Victoria was calculating, sure, but to pull off something like this? To take everything without him even noticing? No, there had to be a mistake. Elliot pulled out his phone and immediately dialed his lawyer. The line rang once, twice. Then, a voice answered, calm, measured. "Elliot," the man greeted. "I assume you've seen the documents." "Seen them?" Elliot nearly growled. "I need to know if they're real." "They're real." Silence. Elliot clenched his jaw, his grip on the phone tightening. "You let this happen," he hissed. There was a sigh on the other end. "You should have been paying attention, Elliot. Victoria's been making moves for years. Legally, she owns those shares. The company, my company. Not anymore. Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. He had always thought Victoria knew her place, that she was simply an extension of his power, a silent supporter of his empire. But she had never been his shadow. She had been watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when she did, she didn't just take a piece of his world. She took everything. Elliot exhaled sharply, his mind already spinning with possible solutions. There had to be a way to fix this, to reverse it, to regain control. He wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't the end. Victoria may have won this round. But Elliot Harrington was not a man who stayed down for long. Elliot's fingers curled around the edges of the divorce papers, his knuckles turning white as the weight of Victoria's words settled over him like a slow, suffocating fog. The ballroom, once alive with laughter and the clinking of glasses, now seemed eerily quiet, as if the air itself had been stolen from the room. The music had stopped. The hum of conversation had faded into whispers. The guests, his guests, stood frozen, their eyes darting between him and Victoria, expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed shock. For the first time in his life, Elliot Harrington had lost control of the room. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. He felt his world shift beneath him, but his body refused to react, as though he were a spectator in his own downfall. He had always believed himself to be the one pulling the strings, the one orchestrating every moment, every transaction, every relationship. But now he was the fool at the center of the spectacle, and Victoria was holding the strings. Victoria. He turned his gaze toward her, searching for something. Uncertainty, hesitation, regret, but there was none. She stood poised, her chin tilted slightly upward, her eyes unwavering. She wasn't basking in the attention, nor was she reveling in his humiliation. She was simply delivering a message, one that had been carefully crafted and executed to perfection. It wasn't just about the divorce. The legal papers in his grip told him that much. She had taken his company, his empire, everything. Elliot's throat was dry, his tongue heavy, as if every word he might have spoken had been stolen before he could form them. His eyes flicked back to the documents, scanning the words through the haze of disbelief. No, this wasn't possible. There had to be a mistake. There had to be something he had missed, some loophole, some way out. But Victoria wasn't the type to make mistakes. The silence stretched too long. Someone coughed awkwardly. A woman near the bar stifled a gasp. Jack Aldridge smirked over the rim of his whiskey glass, watching with obvious enjoyment. Elliot swallowed, forcing his voice to emerge, but when he finally spoke, it wasn't with the commanding presence he was used to. It was with a barely concealed fury beneath a thin veneer of control. "You planned this," he said, his voice low, only for her to hear. Victoria didn't blink. "Of course I did." The confirmation hit harder than he expected. For years, he had assumed Victoria was content. He had assumed that, despite his affairs, despite his growing distance, she would always remain, poised, patient, the ever-loyal partner at his side. They had built a life together, a public image of perfection. It had been an understanding, an unspoken agreement that no matter what happened, they ran the empire together. But that had been his assumption. Victoria had never agreed to be his forever, and now she was proving that, in the most spectacular fashion. Elliot exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair as he straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to pull together the remnants of his composure. He was Elliot Harrington. He didn't lose. He didn't allow himself to be stripped of power without a fight. He had climbed his way to the top, and he would claw his way back if he had to. He turned toward the guests, flashing a tight smile, the kind that was meant to reassure, to dismiss any lingering doubt. "Well," he said smoothly, though there was an undeniable edge to his voice. That was certainly an unexpected surprise. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but no one quite met his eyes. Victoria arched a brow, her expression unreadable. Elliot took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You think this is over?" he murmured, his voice dropping so only she could hear. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, with a voice as steady as ever, she replied, "I think it's only just beginning." The words sent a chill down his spine. His fists clenched at his sides, but before he could respond, before he could formulate his next move, Victoria turned her back to him and walked away. And That was the moment he knew she had truly won. Because she wasn't looking for a fight. She had already ended it. The rest of the evening blurred into a mess of forced smiles and polite small talk. Guests lingered, waiting to see what would happen next. But there was no encore, no grand rebuttal. Elliot knew better than to create a scene. Not yet. He remained composed, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, pretending that nothing had changed even as the whispers continued behind his back. Sienna hovered close, but she was no longer draped over his arm like before. She was watching him carefully now, calculating. She had attached herself to a man of power, a man with everything to offer. But if Elliot Harrington was no longer the man at the top, then what was she still doing here? He could see the doubt flicker in her eyes. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be truly disposable. The irony was almost laughable. By the time the party finally began to wind down, Elliot was seething beneath the surface, every breath laced with the need to retaliate. His phone was already buzzing. His lawyers, his board members, people who had seen the spectacle and were now scrambling for clarification. He ignored them all. There was only one person he needed to speak to. Victoria. He found her on the terrace, standing alone, the city stretching out before her. She didn't turn when he approached, didn't acknowledge his presence. It infuriated him more than any words could have. He stepped closer. "You blindsided me," he said, his voice sharp. Victoria exhaled slowly, finally turning to face him. "Yes." Elliot let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And now what? You think you can run the company without me?" Victoria tilted her head. "I don't think, Elliot. I know." There was no hesitation in her words. No doubt. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Elliot took another step forward, his voice lowering. "You're going to regret this." Victoria's lips curved into the slightest smile. "I don't believe I will." She turned back toward the city, dismissing him once again. And for the first time in his life, Elliot Harrington realized he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the divorce papers, his knuckles whitening with the force of his grip. The carefully curated world he had built around himself was beginning to crack, the foundations trembling beneath him as realization set in. Victoria had not just left him, she had taken everything. The guests, once mesmerized by his wealth and power, now observed him as if he were a fallen king, no longer untouchable, no longer invincible. He could feel their stares pressing into him, burning into his skin like a brand. The conversations had shifted from admiration to amusement, from flattery to whispered gossip. No one dared to say anything to his face. Not yet, at least, but the expressions said enough. He had become the evening's entertainment, the subject of a scandal that would be whispered about for years. Sienna, standing awkwardly beside him, reached out to touch his arm, her fingers barely grazing the fabric of his jacket before he jerked away. He didn't need her pity, didn't need the silent confirmation of his own failure. Her presence, once intoxicating and thrilling, now felt suffocating. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had expected admiration, maybe even envy, when he introduced her tonight. Not this public humiliation. Not this. Victoria had planned it too well. Too perfectly. His mind raced, trying to piece together when it had started. When had she begun orchestrating this betrayal? It wasn't something that could have been arranged overnight. The ownership transfer alone meant she had been slowly dismantling his hold over the company for months, maybe even years. The realization hit like a physical blow. She had been waiting, watching, playing the long game while he had been too busy indulging in distractions. His eyes snapped up, locking onto her figure across the room. She stood with the poise of a queen surveying her court, her emerald gown shimmering under the golden light of the chandeliers, her chin lifted, her expression calm. She wasn't basking in the victory, wasn't reveling in the chaos, because she had already won. This wasn't about gloating. This was about finishing the game. Elliot swallowed hard, forcing his body into motion, willing himself to regain control, to reclaim his composure. He couldn't afford to look weak, not here, not now. But with every step he took, every carefully measured breath, the certainty that had once defined him felt like it was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Victoria," he finally managed, his voice lower, sharper, meant only for her ears. She turned at the sound of her name, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without fear. Yes, she replied smoothly, as if this were any other polite conversation at a social gathering. He took another step closer, lowering his voice further. This isn't over. A hint of amusement flickered in her eyes. I know, she murmured. That's what makes it so satisfying. He exhaled sharply, frustration boiling beneath his skin. You think you can just walk away from this? From me? Her expression remained infuriatingly serene. I don't think, Elliot. I know. His grip on the papers tightened. You won't last without me. Victoria arched a delicate brow. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? He wanted to snap back, wanted to say something that would shake her, that would make her doubt herself, make her falter the way she had just made him. But there was nothing. No words. No threats. Nothing he could say that she hadn't already prepared for. He had walked into his own trap, and he had done it blindly. The sound of murmurs around them grew louder, and Elliot realized they were being watched, that the moment he had hoped to reclaim was slipping even further from his grasp. He could feel the weight of the crowd pressing in, waiting, watching, expecting something from him. But what? A fight? A desperate plea? An angry outburst? No, he refused. Victoria had taken him by surprise, but this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Forcing himself to smile, he took a slow step back, exuding an air of calculated amusement, as if this entire moment was nothing more than an unexpected inconvenience rather than a life-altering disaster. He saw Victoria watching him, assessing him, waiting to see how he would react. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. Lifting his glass, he offered a mock toast, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to them. To unexpected surprises, he said smoothly. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her lips curving just the barest amount. She didn't lift her own glass, but the message was clear. She had no need to. She had already won the game. Elliot turned away before she could say anything else, striding toward the exit with his head held high, the papers still clutched in his grip. The crowd parted for him as he walked, whispers following in his wake like shadows that wouldn't be shaken. Sienna hesitated for a moment before trailing after him, her movements less confident than before. She was reevaluating him, calculating what staying by his side would mean now that he wasn't at the top. He could feel it, sense the shift in her demeanor. He didn't care. All that mattered now was figuring out how to undo what Victoria had done. Because he would. He had no choice. Across the ballroom, Victoria watched as Elliot disappeared through the double doors, the tension in the room shifting as the night continued without him. The music swelled once again, conversations resumed, and soon the guests were laughing, drinking, returning to their carefully curated world of luxury and intrigue. Victoria exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline settle. She had expected a fight. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even a public display of outrage. But Elliot had surprised her, not by retaliating, but by not reacting at all. That, more than anything, meant he was planning something. She had known this wasn't the end, but she wasn't afraid. Victoria turned toward the city lights shimmering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, reflecting everything she had worked for, everything she had fought to reclaim. This was just the beginning, and she was ready. The night air outside the grand estate was cool, crisp, and utterly indifferent to the spectacle that had unfolded inside. Elliot Harrington stepped onto the marble steps leading to his private car, his posture rigid, his grip on the divorce papers tightening with every step. Behind him, the party continued, as if nothing had happened, as if his humiliation had simply become part of the evening's entertainment. The sound of clinking glasses and low laughter still echoed from within, a cruel reminder that, while his world had just imploded, the rest of them would move on, eager to dissect every detail behind closed doors. The headlights of his black town car cut through the darkness, illuminating the path before him. But Elliot's mind was already elsewhere, racing through the events of the night, searching for the moment. The exact moment. When he had lost control. He slid into the leather interior, the door shutting with a heavy, final click, sealing him away from the murmurs of the partygoers and the knowing looks that had burned into his skin. Victoria's voice still lingered in his mind. The cold precision of her words. The way she had dismantled him without a single moment of hesitation. The moment wasn't just humiliating. It was fatal. "Where to, Mr. Harrington?" the driver asked, his voice even professional. Elliot stared out the window, his jaw tightening. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. His penthouse, once his sanctuary, now felt suffocating. The office, the one place he had always controlled, was no longer his. He had spent his life building an empire so vast, so unshakable, that he never once considered what would happen if someone took it from him. But that was exactly what Victoria had done. The woman he had underestimated. The woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a silent shadow. She had not only walked away, she had walked away with everything. Mr. Harrington? Elliot inhaled sharply through his nose. Drive. To where, sir? He didn't answer. The car pulled away from the curb, the city lights streaking past in a blur of gold and silver. Back inside the estate, Victoria stood near the center of the ballroom, the energy in the room shifting around her. She had expected more resistance. Expected Elliot to lash out, to demand an explanation, to refuse to believe that he had lost. But instead, he had walked away, and in doing so, he had proven something important. He had no move left to make. It should have felt satisfying. And yet, Victoria knew better than to assume it was over. She turned slightly, her gaze finding Sienna Blake standing off to the side, her figure bathed in the soft glow of the chandeliers. Sienna had once looked powerful, confident, a woman who had believed she had climbed to the top of the social hierarchy by attaching herself to the right man. Now, she looked uncertain, as if she were only just realizing the true cost of her choices. Victoria took a slow sip from her champagne glass before making her way toward her. Sienna straightened when she noticed her approach, but there was no confidence behind her movements, no trace of the smugness she had exuded earlier in the night. She looked wary, as if she expected Victoria to lash out, to offer some kind of scathing remark. But Victoria didn't need to. She simply tilted her head slightly and spoke, her voice as smooth as silk. He's all yours now. Sienna's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but nothing came out. Victoria smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile one gave out of warmth. It was a smile of understanding, a smile that said, I know exactly what you are, and I know exactly what's coming for you. With nothing, the words landed heavier than she expected. Sienna swallowed, her throat bobbing slightly. What are you? I mean exactly what I said, Victoria interrupted, her tone never rising, never faltering. You can have him. All of him. But he has nothing now. Sienna hesitated. He'll recover. Victoria let out a quiet, almost sympathetic laugh. Will he? Sienna's expression faltered. Doubt. A sharp contrast from the woman who had walked into the party on Elliot's arm, sure of her place, sure of her victory. Victoria took another slow sip of her drink, allowing the weight of the silence between them to settle before she finally leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only Sienna could hear. You attached yourself to a man for his wealth, his power, his influence. You thought that by standing next to him, you would inherit all of it. She tilted her head slightly. Tell me, now that he has none of those things, what exactly does that make you? Sienna stiffened, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and something else. Fear. Because for the first time, she realized what she had done. Victoria pulled back, watching as the wheels turned behind Sienna's eyes, as she slowly began to understand. She had bet on the wrong man. I suppose we'll find out, Victoria said lightly, taking another sip before turning on her heel, leaving Sienna standing there, her mind racing through the implications. The music played on, the guests laughing, drinking, but Sienna wasn't listening anymore. Because for the first time, she wasn't certain where she stood, and that kind of uncertainty was terrifying. The car finally slowed to a stop. Elliot blinked, his thoughts unraveling as he realized where he had told the driver to go without even realizing it. The office. Or, rather, what used to be his office. The towering glass building loomed above him, its windows reflecting the city lights, an unshakable monument to his once undeniable power. His empire. His life's work. And now, it belonged to Victoria. His stomach turned, a mixture of fury and something dangerously close to fear creeping into his veins. He had spent years cultivating his influence, ensuring that no one could challenge him. And yet, he had been brought to his knees in a single evening. No, this wasn't over. Elliot pushed the door open, stepping into the cool night air, his breath steadying as he stared up at the building, at the penthouse office where Victoria was undoubtedly making her next move. He had walked away tonight, but it wasn't because he had accepted defeat. It was because he needed time. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of his revenge. The city skyline stretched endlessly before him, a glittering maze of steel and glass. But for the first time in his life, Elliot Harrington felt small. The office building that had once belonged to him, the empire he had built from the ground up, was now out of his reach. It stood there, unmoved by his downfall, a monument to his past power and his present failure. The realization settled into his bones like a slow poison. Victoria had taken everything. Not just his company, his control, his influence, his very identity. He clenched his jaw, shoving his hands into his pockets as the cold night air bit at his skin. He needed to think, needed to act, but for the first time in years, he had no clear path forward. Every move he had made, every calculated risk, every underhanded deal, it had all been for this. And now, in the span of a single evening, it was gone. The driver had asked if he wanted to go home. But what was home now? His penthouse, once a symbol of his wealth and success, now felt hollow. Without the power he wielded, it was nothing more than an expensive prison. He couldn't go back there. Not yet. Instead, he found himself wandering. The streets, lined with people who had no idea who he was or what had happened, moved around him as if he were invisible. Once, he had commanded attention with nothing more than his presence. People had parted for him, eyes filled with admiration or envy. But now, he was just another man in a suit, walking with no destination, no direction. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But he needed answers. He pulled it out, barely glancing at the name before pressing it to his ear. "Tell me you found something," he said, his voice low, controlled, but laced with tension. A pause. Then, his lawyer's voice came through, measured, cautious. Too cautious. "There's no mistake, Elliot. It's done." Elliot's grip tightened around the phone. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Victoria moved her assets months ago. Every decision was calculated. Every loophole was closed before you even knew to look. She didn't just take your company. She erased your ability to fight for it." Elliot exhaled sharply, his teeth grinding together. "There has to be a way. There isn't." He stopped walking. The streetlights cast long shadows around him, stretching into the distance. His breath was slow, steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. No, there was always a way. Victoria had been meticulous, but she wasn't infallible. She had help. He muttered, more to himself than to the man on the other end of the line. "Find out who." The lawyer hesitated. "Elliot, do it." Silence. Then, a quiet sigh. "I'll see what I can uncover." The call ended, leaving Elliot standing alone beneath the dim glow of the city. His mind raced, searching for the weakness, the flaw in her strategy. She had planned this too well for it to be impulsive, which meant she had been working with someone close, someone who had access to his business, his accounts, his future, and that someone was going to regret it. Victoria sat in the sleek, high-backed chair of what had once been his office, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the glass desk. The city stretched out before her, a sprawling canvas of light and motion. It felt different sitting here now, not because she had taken it from him, but because she had finally taken it for herself. Elliot had never seen her as a threat. That was his first mistake. He had underestimated her, believing that she would remain where he had placed her, beside him, behind him, beneath him. But he had never once considered that she might be watching, learning, planning. She exhaled slowly, letting her gaze drift over the expanse of the city. She knew Elliot well enough to know this wasn't over. He wasn't the type to walk away, to accept defeat. He was already searching for a way back in. She welcomed the challenge. Her phone vibrated against the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A single message. "He's already looking for cracks." Victoria smiled. Of course, he was. That was the difference between them. Elliot had spent his life playing to win. She had spent hers playing to own the game. Hours passed before Elliot finally returned to the penthouse, the weight of the night pressing into his shoulders. The space was too quiet, too empty. It didn't feel like a home anymore. Maybe it never had. Sienna was waiting inside, still in her crimson dress, perched on the edge of the couch, her expression tense. She had been silent for most of the ride back, watching him, studying him. He didn't have the energy for whatever conversation she wanted to have. "Say whatever you're thinking and get it over with," he muttered, loosening his tie. Sienna inhaled slowly. "Are you going to fix this?" Elliot let out a short, humorless laugh. "Fix it?" He turned to her, shaking his head. "You think this is something I can just fix?" She hesitated. "I think you always find a way to win." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Not this time." Sienna stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, his voice quieter now, "Victoria planned this too well. She was ahead of me from the start. This wasn't some impulsive revenge. This was a systematic takedown." Sienna's lips pressed together. "So what now?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the doubt. She was waiting, calculating. She had attached herself to his power. But what happened when that power was gone? Elliot didn't answer her. He didn't need to. Sienna sighed, standing. "You'll figure something out," she said, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving him standing there alone. Elliot watched her go, his hands flexing at his sides. He had never been powerless before, and he wasn't about to start now. His mind sharpened, cutting through the haze of shock, of anger, of humiliation. If Victoria thought this was over, she was wrong. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning, and he would make sure she regretted ever believing she could take what was his. Sienna Blake had always believed she was meant for more. She wasn't born into wealth, didn't come from a family of privilege or legacy, but she had learned early that money wasn't just power, it was freedom. And if she played her cards right, she would never have to worry about anything again. She had spent her life perfecting the art of positioning, of aligning herself with the right people, saying the right things, wearing the right clothes, moving in circles she wasn't born into but had learned to navigate with ease. Elliot Harrington had been the perfect target. Powerful, wealthy, careless. A man who had built an empire but never learned to watch his back. A man who had everything but was always searching for more. When she met him, she had known instantly that he was her way in. She had played the role effortlessly, the distraction, the excitement, the escape from his perfectly curated world. She had let him believe he was the one in control, that he had chosen her, that she was simply a beautiful woman who had fallen into his orbit, dazzled by his wealth, his dominance, his arrogance. And for a while, she had enjoyed it. The luxury, the attention, the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had attached herself to a man who could give her everything. But tonight, standing in the penthouse that had once belonged to a king and now felt more like a tomb, she wondered if she had bet on the wrong man. Elliot hadn't spoken in over an hour. He sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, his expression unreadable. She had never seen him like this before, silent, withdrawn, a shadow of the man she had seduced. He wasn't supposed to lose. Sienna exhaled slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she crossed the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Elliot." No response. She hesitated, then sat beside him, keeping her posture relaxed, careful. "You're thinking," she murmured, her voice soft, coaxing. "That's good. That means you have a plan." Elliot didn't look at her. Her stomach tightened slightly. This wasn't the man she knew. She leaned in, her fingers brushing against his arm. "Elliot, talk to me." Finally, he shifted, his eyes flicking toward her, but there was something in his gaze that made her uneasy. "I lost," he said simply. Sienna forced a small smile. "Not forever." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You don't understand. Victoria didn't just take the company. She took my leverage, my influence. The board won't back me now. Investors will hesitate. My name isn't enough anymore." He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw, the weight of his own words settling in his chest like lead. "She didn't just win. She ended me." Sienna stared at him, her heart pounding. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to fight back, to come out stronger, to reclaim what was his. That was the plan. That was why she had chosen him. "I don't believe that," she said quickly, her voice sharper now, pushing through the panic threatening to rise in her throat. "You're Elliot Harrington. You built this empire once, you can do it again." Elliot let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself more than me." Sienna stiffened. "I'm trying to remind you of who you are." "Who I was," he corrected. She swallowed hard. "So what? You're just giving up." He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Do you want the truth, Sienna?" She hesitated. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice lower now, almost cold. "I spent my life making sure I was always in control, that no one could take what was mine. I thought I had mastered the game. But Victoria, she wasn't playing the same game. She rewrote the rules before I even realized we weren't on the same board." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know how to win this one." Sienna felt her pulse quicken. "You're acting like it's over." Elliot tilted his head slightly, studying her, and for the first time, she felt exposed. "You're afraid," he murmured. She stiffened. "Of course I'm not." A slow smile, but it wasn't the one she was used to. It wasn't the lazy, confident smirk of a man who knew he could have whatever he wanted. It was something else entirely. Amusement. Amusement at her. Sienna's fingers curled slightly. "What?" Elliot exhaled through his nose. "You backed the wrong horse." Her stomach dropped. He saw it. The flicker of panic in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't sure where she stood. And Elliot, despite everything, despite the humiliation, despite the loss, found some small, cruel pleasure in that. Because Sienna had never truly cared about him. She had cared about what he could give her, and now he had nothing. Sienna's lips parted, as if to argue, as if to deny it, but there was nothing to say. They both knew the truth. Elliot leaned back again, dragging a hand down his face. "So," he murmured. "What now, Sienna?" Her throat was dry. "What do you mean?" His gaze was slow, deliberate. "Are you staying?" Her breath caught. That was the moment, the exact moment she realized what he was doing. He wasn't asking. He was watching, waiting, testing. Sienna inhaled sharply, tilting her chin up. "I'm here, aren't I?" Elliot smirked slightly, but it wasn't triumphant. It wasn't reassured. It was knowing. Because they both knew the truth. She was already planning her exit, and it was only a matter of time before she took it. Silence stretched between them, thick, heavy, filled with unspoken truths and unraveling illusions. Sienna had chosen him when he was on top. Now, she was realizing what it meant to be next to a fallen king. And Elliot, despite the wreckage of his world, despite the uncertainty of what came next, saw it for what it was. She wouldn't stay. She was just waiting for the right moment to leave. And for the first time in his life, Elliot understood what it felt like to be disposable. The irony was almost laughable. The city stretched before Victoria like an empire finally claimed, the glass windows of her office reflecting the shimmering skyline as dawn threatened to break the horizon. She had spent years in the background, observing, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the tables. And now, sitting in what had once been Elliot's chair, at the head of his empire, she had done it. She had won. But victory wasn't just about taking power. It was about keeping it. She leaned back in the plush leather chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the desk. The silence of the office was heavy, the weight of her new reality settling around her. It felt different than she expected, not lighter, but heavier, more profound. She had spent years strategizing for this moment, but now that it was here, she understood something crucial. Power was never about the acquisition. It was about control. And control was a battle fought every single day. A soft chime broke the silence. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Harrington, the board is assembled." Victoria inhaled deeply, smoothing the fabric of her dark emerald dress before pressing the button. "I'll be right in." She rose slowly, casting one last glance at the city before striding toward the door. Today would mark the true beginning of her reign. The boardroom was filled with tension so thick it could have choked the air itself. Every seat at the long mahogany table was occupied, powerful men in tailored suits shifting in their chairs, their carefully composed faces barely concealing their discomfort. This was the first time they would sit across from her instead of Elliot, and they didn't know how to feel about it. Victoria stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her presence commanding attention before she even spoke. She met their gazes one by one, her expression unreadable, her silence deliberate. She took her seat at the head of the table. Elliot's seat. A slow murmur rippled through the room. Good. Let them feel it. Let them understand that this was her company now. One of the older board members, Franklin Greaves, cleared his throat, leaning forward with a well-rehearsed expression of feigned neutrality. "Victoria," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, designed to manipulate. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that recent events have left us all surprised. She tilted her head slightly, allowing the silence to stretch before responding. I'm sure they have. A few men exchanged glances. Franklin continued, his fingers interlocked on the table. Elliot's leadership has been the foundation of this company for years. Naturally, there's some concern about continuity. Victoria allowed a small, knowing smile. You mean there's concern about whether a woman can run a company that she already legally owns? A flicker of discomfort passed through Franklin's eyes. He wasn't expecting bluntness. Good. Another board member, Richard Caldwell, shifted slightly. It's just that Elliot had a very specific vision for the future of the company, he added carefully. Victoria arched a brow. And how has that vision served us in the last quarter? Silence. She leaned forward, folding her hands neatly on the table. Elliot was reckless. He operated on power moves and instinct, but he failed to anticipate shifts in the market. He made this company synonymous with his name instead of its success. That is why he was easy to dismantle. Her voice never wavered, every word measured, precise. Now, you have a choice. You can resist change and fight a battle you will lose, or you can adapt. More silence. Franklin finally sighed, rubbing his temple. And what exactly is your vision, Victoria? She smiled then, slow, calculated. To turn this company into something indestructible. The room exhaled collectively. Some of them were still hesitant. Some would undoubtedly try to fight her. But others, the smarter ones, would see the inevitable. Victoria didn't need their approval. She only needed their obedience. Meanwhile, across the city, Elliot Harrington sat in a darkened bar, the ice in his glass melting untouched. The neon glow from the liquor shelves flickered over his sharp features, but he barely noticed. He had spent his life untouchable, indestructible, and yet, Victoria had dismantled him like a poorly built house of cards. Everything he had built, every connection, every hard-earned deal, every carefully placed piece of his empire, gone. He had spent the last 24 hours reaching out to his contacts, the people he had made rich, the men who had once owed him their careers. But the responses had been the same. Silence. Or worse, polite refusals. They weren't willing to risk crossing Victoria. Not now. Elliot exhaled through his nose, his jaw clenching. Victoria thought she had won. She thought this was over. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Didn't expect to find you drinking alone. Elliot didn't have to look up. Jack Aldrich. His longtime business rival slid into the seat across from him, a smirk tugging at his lips as he signaled for a drink. You enjoying the show? Elliot muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Jack chuckled. Oh, immensely. I have to say your wife, excuse me, ex-wife, put on quite a performance. Watching her dismantle you was some of the finest business strategy I've ever seen. He paused, eyes gleaming. Almost impressive. Elliot finally lifted his gaze, something dangerous flashing behind his eyes. You didn't come here just to gloat. Jack grinned. No, I came to offer you something. Elliot's grip tightened around his glass. And what's that? Jack leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough. Away back in. The words sent a sharp jolt through Elliot's system. He had been searching for a foothold, for anything he could use to claw his way back. He hadn't expected an opportunity to walk right up to him. Jack watched him carefully, his smirk never fading. Victoria may own your company, but that doesn't mean she's invincible. She has enemies. People who would love nothing more than to see her fail. He took a slow sip of his drink. And you? You know exactly where to hit her. Elliot exhaled slowly. For the first time since his world had crumbled, something inside him clicked into place. Victoria thought she had buried him, but she had only created a man with nothing left to lose. And that made him dangerous. Jack tilted his glass slightly. So, are you in? Elliot didn't hesitate. A slow, deliberate smirk curved his lips. I'm in. The city stretched before Victoria like an empire fully conquered, the skyline bathed in the warm glow of the early morning light. She stood at the edge of her office, arms folded, watching the reflection of the room in the vast windows rather than the city itself. This space, once Elliot's, was now hers. The world that had always belonged to him had been slowly dismantled, restructured, and molded to fit her vision. And yet, the victory did not feel weightless. Behind her, The quiet shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur of her assistant organizing files filled the silence. It was early, far too early for anyone else to be in the office, but Victoria had never been one to sleep when there was work to be done. Then, the sound of the door opening. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Elliot. His presence, once suffocating, now felt more like an afterthought. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in her space, not in her world, not after everything. But she had known this moment was inevitable. He had lost too much to simply disappear. The weight of his footsteps echoed softly across the room. Deliberate, slow, but lacking the commanding presence they once carried. He had always walked with power, always exuded an aura of dominance. But now, he was merely a man who had been left with nothing. "You've been busy," he murmured, his voice softer than she expected. Victoria finally turned, her gaze settling on him with a quiet steadiness. He looked different. Not physically. His suit was still impeccably tailored, his hair still styled with practiced ease, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a weight there, a burden he had never carried before. "I had work to do," she said simply, moving toward her desk, her fingers brushing over the cool surface. "There was a company to run." Elliot exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And you're running it well." It wasn't a compliment. Not really. It was an acknowledgement of reality. Silence stretched between them, thick, heavy, filled with all the things neither of them wanted to say. Victoria finally broke it. "Why are you here, Elliot?" He took a slow step forward, but not close enough to threaten, just enough to show that he wasn't ready to disappear completely. "I wanted to see for myself," he admitted, his gaze sweeping over the office. "See what it looks like without me." Her expression remained unreadable, and he let out a quiet chuckle, but it lacked amusement. "It looks complete." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him, trying to decipher what he wanted, what he was still holding on to. "You didn't think I could do it." He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his jaw. "No," he admitted. "I didn't." She should have been angry. Maybe months ago, she would have been. Maybe the thought of him dismissing her, never truly believing in her abilities, would have cut deeper. But now it felt expected. He had never seen her. Not really. He had loved what she represented, what she provided, the role she played in his perfectly curated world. But he had never looked at her the way she had looked at him. Strategically, as an opponent. "I underestimated you," Elliot said, his voice lower now, more measured. "I thought I had you figured out. I thought I knew how far you would go." He met her gaze, something flickering behind his eyes. Not anger, not regret, but something closer to reluctant admiration. "I was wrong." Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the first honest thing you've said in years." Elliot let out a quiet breath, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe this was how it had all ended. Because that's what this was. The end. Not of their fight, not of their business entanglements, but of them. Victoria had spent years being Elliot's wife, being the silent force behind his power, being his greatest ally and his greatest liability. But now, standing here, watching him finally see her for the first time, she realized she didn't need that anymore. She had won. Not because she had taken the company. Not because she had walked away with his wealth, his influence, his status. She had won because, for the first time in her entire life, she was standing on her own. And Elliot? Elliot was the one left behind. He watched her for a long moment, as if waiting for something. Maybe an apology. Maybe an acknowledgement that she had been ruthless, that she had done to him exactly what he had spent his entire life doing to others. Maybe he wanted her to admit that there was still something left between them. But there wasn't. There never really had been. Victoria exhaled slowly, stepping back toward her desk. "There's nothing left for you here, Elliot." Something flickered across his face. Acceptance. It was a foreign thing. Watching a man like Elliot Harrington realize he had finally met his match. That he had already lost. He swallowed. Then, after a long pause, simply nodded. "I guess there isn't." She expected him to turn and leave, but he lingered for just a fraction longer, as if memorizing the moment. Then, finally, he stepped toward the door, his movements slow, measured. He didn't look back. And Victoria? Victoria didn't stop him. She turned back toward the window, watching as the sky began to shift into daylight, the city stretching before her like a future finally within reach. She had spent years standing behind Elliot Harrington. And now? Now, she was walking forward, alone, and for the first time, that felt like freedom.